I never imagined that the loudest sound in my life would become silence. At 83 years old, I sat alone in the same rocking chair where I had spent decades watching my children grow. The chair creaked softly beneath me as I looked out the living room window. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that hurts. Once, this home had been filled with life. There were birthday parties, holiday dinners, laughter bouncing off the walls, and little feet running through the hallways. Now there was only me. My name is Walter, and this is the story of how my own children abandoned me, and how everything changed when they discovered what I had done with my inheritance. But before I tell you what happened, you need to understand how we got here. Because no family falls apart overnight. It happens one small disappointment at a time. One forgotten phone call. One canceled visit. One excuse after another. Until one day you wake up and realize you're completely alone. My wife, Margaret, passed away 8 years ago. 49 years of marriage. 49 years of waking up beside the same woman. 49 years of sharing every joy and every hardship together. Then one morning she was gone. Cancer took her faster than anyone expected. The doctors did their best. We all hoped. But hope wasn't enough. After the funeral, everyone promised they would be there for me. My son Michael hugged me tightly. "Dad, you're not alone. We'll take care of you." My daughter Susan wiped tears from her eyes. "We'll visit every week." My youngest son David nodded. "Anything you need, just call." I believed them. Why wouldn't I? They were my children. I had spent my entire life loving them, protecting them, sacrificing for them. Surely they would keep their promises. At first they did. The first few months weren't so bad. Michael stopped by occasionally. Susan called every Sunday. David visited when his schedule allowed. But then life became busy. Or at least that's what they said. The weekly visits became monthly visits. The monthly visits became holiday visits. The phone calls became text messages. The text messages became silence. I kept making excuses for them. Michael had a demanding job. Susan was raising teenagers. David lived 2 hours away. I understood. At least I told myself I did. One evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at an untouched birthday cake. It was my 79th birthday. I had bought the cake myself. Chocolate. Margaret's favorite. I thought maybe the children would stop by. Maybe they had planned a surprise. Maybe they were running late. I waited, and waited, and waited. By 10 o'clock that night, the candles remained unlit. No one came, no one called, no one even remembered. The next morning, Michael sent a text. "Sorry, Dad. Busy day yesterday. Happy birthday. Busy day." That was it. 4 words. After everything, I stared at the message for a long time. Then I quietly put my phone down. Something inside me cracked that day. Not shattered, just cracked. Like a small fracture in glass. Invisible at first, but growing wider with time. The years continued, and the distance grew. One winter, I slipped on ice outside my house. I fell hard. Pain shot through my hip. I couldn't stand. For nearly an hour, I lay there in the freezing cold. Eventually, a neighbor found me and called an ambulance. At the hospital, the nurse asked who she should contact. I gave her Michael's number. No answer. She tried Susan. Voicemail. David finally answered after several attempts. He sounded annoyed. "I'll come if I can." If I can. I remember staring at the ceiling afterward, trying not to cry, trying not to feel hurt. But it's difficult not to feel hurt when your own children treat you like an inconvenience. When I returned home, my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, checked on me every day. She brought soup, helped with groceries, asked how I was feeling. A woman who wasn't related to me showed more care than my own family. Think about that. Sometimes kindness comes from strangers, and neglect comes from the people you love most. As I entered my 80s, things became even harder. Driving at night wasn't easy anymore. My hearing wasn't what it used to be. Simple tasks took longer. I didn't need much. I wasn't asking anyone to take care of me. I just wanted connection, a phone call, a visit, a reminder that I still mattered. Instead, I became invisible. One Christmas, all 3 children came to dinner. For a brief moment, the house felt alive again. The grandchildren laughed. The smell of turkey filled the air. The living room buzzed with conversation. I thought perhaps things were changing. Perhaps they remembered what family meant. Then I noticed something strange. Whenever they spoke to me, the conversation eventually turned toward money. Michael asked about my savings. Susan asked whether I had updated my will. David wanted to know what would happen to the house someday. At first, I ignored it. But as the evening continued, the questions became more obvious, more direct, more uncomfortable. I sat quietly and listened. For the first time, I realized something painful. They weren't interested in me. They were interested in what I owned, the house, the savings, the inheritance, the things I would leave behind. That realization hurt more than loneliness ever could. Because loneliness is painful, but feeling used by your own children is devastating. That night, after everyone left, I walked through the empty house. The silence returned. I stood in front of a photograph of Margaret. She was smiling in the picture, the same smile that carried me through almost 5 decades of marriage. I picked up the frame, and I spoke out loud. I think we've failed somewhere. My voice trembled. I don't know where. I don't know when. But something went wrong. Tears filled my eyes. Because parents spend their lives believing they did enough, that they taught the right lessons, that love will come back to them someday. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes children grow up believing they're entitled to everything. Sometimes they forget the sacrifices that built their lives. Sometimes they remember your assets but forget your heart. A few weeks later, something happened that changed everything. A letter arrived, not from my children, not from a friend, but from a lawyer handling the estate of my older brother Henry. Henry had never married. He had no children. For years, we rarely discussed money. I assumed he had lived a modest life. I was wrong, very wrong. The letter informed me that Henry had passed away, and according to his will, he had left me something unexpected, something significant, something that would completely change the course of my remaining years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table holding that letter, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. I had no idea that the inheritance waiting for me would soon reveal the true character of everyone around me, especially my children. And once they discovered what I chose to do with that money, nothing would ever be the same again. For 3 days, I couldn't stop thinking about that letter. It sat on my kitchen table beside my morning coffee, almost daring me to open it again. Every time I looked at it, I thought about my brother Henry. We had spent our childhood together, 2 boys growing up during difficult times, sharing one bedroom, working summer jobs, dreaming about the future. Life eventually pulled us in different directions, but we never stopped caring about each other. Now he was gone, and somehow his final gift had found its way to me. The following Monday, I drove to the lawyer's office. The building was located downtown, surrounded by modern glass towers that made me feel very old. The receptionist greeted me kindly and guided me into a conference room. A few minutes later, the lawyer entered carrying several folders. He smiled warmly. "Mr. Walter Harrison, thank you for coming." I nodded. "I wish it were under better circumstances." "So do I," he replied. "Your brother spoke very highly of you." Hearing those words made my chest tighten. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that someone still spoke well of me. The lawyer opened the folder. Then he began explaining the details of Henry's estate. At first, I listened quietly. Then my eyes widened. Then my jaw nearly dropped. I honestly thought I had misunderstood. "Excuse me," I interrupted. "Did you say $1.8 million? The lawyer nodded. "Wes," I stared at him. Surely there had been a mistake. Henry had always lived simply. He drove old cars, wore inexpensive clothes, rarely talked about money. But over the years, he had invested wisely, purchased property, and built substantial savings. And because he had no immediate family, He had chosen to leave nearly everything to me. Me, an 83-year-old widower who spent most evenings eating dinner alone. I left the office in complete shock. The entire drive home felt unreal. I kept thinking about what Margaret would say. She always had a way of simplifying life's biggest moments. I could almost hear her voice. Walter, money doesn't change people. It reveals them. At the time, I didn't fully understand how true those words would become. The first week after receiving the inheritance was peaceful. No one knew. Not my children, not my neighbors, not even my closest friends. I wanted time to think, time to decide what should happen next. One evening, I sat on the back porch watching the sunset. The orange light stretched across the yard Margaret had loved so much. I thought about all the possibilities. I could travel, buy a new home, hire full-time help, spend every dollar on myself. After all, I was 83 years old. Most people would say I had earned it. But something felt wrong. The truth was simple. I didn't need luxury. I didn't need expensive cars. I didn't need a larger house. What I needed couldn't be purchased. I needed purpose. And purpose is something money alone can never provide. A week later, Susan called unexpectedly. That alone was unusual. She normally texted. "Hi, Dad," she said cheerfully. Her voice sounded different, almost too cheerful. We talked for a few minutes. Then she casually asked, "So, anything new happening?" The question seemed harmless, until she asked it 3 more times. Finally, I understood. Somehow she had heard something. News travels fast in families, especially when money is involved. I kept my answer simple. Nothing much. There was a pause, then disappointment. Small, but noticeable. The conversation ended shortly afterward. 3 days later, Michael called, then David, then Susan again. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk. It was amazing. For years, I had struggled to get a 5-minute phone call. Now my phone wouldn't stop ringing. I couldn't help noticing the timing. The attention felt less like love and more like curiosity. The following Sunday, all 3 children showed up at my house. Together. That hadn't happened in years. Susan brought cookies. Michael offered to mow the lawn. David asked whether I needed repairs around the house. The performance was almost impressive. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed they cared. We sat in the living room drinking coffee. The conversation danced around one topic, money. Nobody wanted to mention it directly, but everyone kept circling closer. Finally, Michael spoke. "Dad, we heard Uncle Henry left you something." There it was. The real reason for the visit. I nodded. He did. Was it significant? Susan asked carefully. "I significant enough?" The room grew quiet. Then David leaned forward. "You should be careful at your age. Managing money can be complicated." At your age, I almost laughed. Apparently, I was too old to manage my own finances, but not too old to leave them an inheritance. Interesting logic. For the next hour, they offered advice. Unsolicited advice. Michael suggested financial planners. Susan discussed estate planning. David talked about protecting assets. Every recommendation somehow benefited them. Not me, them. As they spoke, I simply listened, observing, learning, seeing things more clearly than ever before. When they finally left, I sat alone in silence. And for the first time, I stopped making excuses for them. No more pretending. No more rationalizing. No more convincing myself that they were simply busy. The truth was standing right in front of me. They remembered me when money entered the picture. Not before. Not during lonely birthdays. Not after hospital visits. Not during holidays spent alone. Money had brought them back, not love. A few days later, I visited a local community center. It wasn't a place I normally went, but something had caught my attention. A flyer posted near the grocery store. The center operated programs for elderly people who had no family support. Widows, widowers, retired veterans, people forgotten by society, people a lot like me. The director gave me a tour. What I saw broke my heart. Some residents rarely received visitors. Some hadn't seen family members in years. One gentleman told me his son lived 20 minutes away, but hadn't visited in almost 3 years. A woman named Eleanor celebrated her 89th birthday with only staff members present. I saw loneliness everywhere. Not dramatic loneliness, quiet loneliness, the kind that slowly steals pieces of your spirit. As I listened to their stories, something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't alone. There were thousands of people facing the same pain. Abandoned, forgotten, overlooked, yet still hoping someone cared. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Henry's money, and I kept thinking about those people. Then an idea entered my mind. A simple idea, a powerful idea, an idea that would eventually shock my children. What if this inheritance wasn't meant for me? What if it wasn't meant for my children either? What if it could help people who truly needed it? The thought stayed with me for days, then weeks. The more I considered it, the more certain I became. I met with financial advisors, attorneys, community leaders. I asked questions, explored possibilities, created plans, and little by little, a vision began taking shape. Meanwhile, my children became increasingly interested in my finances. Susan started mentioning future expenses. Michael discussed family investments. David talked openly about inheritance taxes. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. One evening, Michael looked directly at me and said something I will never forget. "Dad, it would be smart to keep the money in the family." The family. I almost asked which family he meant. The family that forgot my birthdays. The family that never visited. The family that only appeared after hearing about an inheritance. Instead, I smiled politely and said nothing. Because by then, my decision had already been made. A decision none of them would see coming. A decision that would change many lives. A decision inspired by every lonely senior sitting in empty houses wondering why their children never call. Over the next few months, I worked quietly behind the scenes. Paperwork was completed. Legal documents were drafted. Funds were allocated. Plans were finalized. And throughout it all, I told nobody. Not even my children. Especially not my children. Because I wanted their actions to reveal who they truly were before they learned the truth. What happened next would expose every hidden motive, every false smile, every selfish intention. And when the day finally arrived for my family to discover what I had done with the inheritance, their reaction would be something none of us would ever forget. For most of my life, I believed that being a good father meant putting your children first, no matter what. No matter how tired you were, no matter how much you sacrificed, you worked longer hours, you skipped vacations, you delayed your own dreams. You gave because that's what parents do. And for decades, I never questioned it. Not once. I worked overtime to help pay for college tuition. I refinanced my home when Michael's business struggled. I emptied savings accounts when Susan went through a difficult divorce. I helped David make a down payment on his first house. Every time they needed something, I was there. Every single time. Not because I expected repayment. Not because I wanted praise. But because they were my children. That's what fathers do. Yet now, sitting alone in my living room at 83 years old, I found myself asking a difficult question. What happens when the people you've spent your entire life helping no longer see you as a person? What happens when they only see what you can give them? The answer was painful. But it was also freeing. Because once you stop living under an illusion, you can finally see the truth. And the truth gives you power. The following month, I completed the final paperwork. The inheritance from Henry had officially been transferred. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was exactly as I wanted. When I signed the final page, I felt something unexpected. Peace, not excitement, not pride. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've made the right decision, even if other people won't understand it. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to attend a fundraising event at the community center. The same center I had visited months earlier. The director, Karen, asked if I would be willing to speak briefly about the challenges elderly people face. At first, I hesitated. I had never enjoyed public speaking, but something told me I should do it, so I agreed. What nobody knew was that I had another reason for attending. A much bigger reason. The event took place on a Saturday afternoon. More than 100 people attended. Community leaders, local business owners, families, volunteers, residents from the center. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. For many of the seniors there, it was one of the few social events they experienced all year. I looked around and saw faces filled with loneliness, resilience, and quiet dignity. People who had spent entire lifetimes raising families, building communities, and contributing to society. Yet many of them now felt forgotten, invisible. That reality broke my heart. When my turn came to speak, I slowly walked to the podium. The room became quiet. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. For a moment, I saw Margaret's face in my mind. Then Henry's. Then all the people who had helped shape my life. I took a deep breath. "My name is Walter Harrison," I began, "and I'm 83 years old." A few people smiled. "I stand here today as someone who understands loneliness." The room grew even quieter. Not because I live alone. Living alone isn't the same as being lonely. Several heads nodded. Loneliness happens when the people you love forget you're still here. The audience listened carefully. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked emotional. I continued. "There are seniors all around us who feel abandoned. People who spent decades caring for others, only to spend their final years wondering if anyone remembers them." A woman in the front row wiped away a tear. I wasn't telling a story. I was telling the truth. My truth. And the truth of countless others. Then I shared experiences from the center. The gentleman whose son never visited. The widow who spent birthdays alone. The veterans forgotten after years of service. The room became silent, heavy. Emotional. Real. Then I reached the final part of my speech. The part nobody expected, including my children. Because yes, they were there. All three of them. Seated together near the back. They had come after hearing I was speaking publicly. Perhaps they were curious. Perhaps they were worried. Perhaps they simply wanted to stay close to the inheritance. Whatever the reason, they were about to hear something that would change everything. I looked toward the audience, then spoke clearly. Several months ago, I received a substantial inheritance from my late brother Henry. Immediately, heads turned. I noticed Michael sit up straighter. Susan exchanged a glance with David. The room became attentive. I spent many months thinking about what to do with that gift. A pause. A gift that represented a lifetime of hard work. Another pause. And after careful consideration, I reached a decision. I could feel the tension building. Then I said the words that changed everything. I have donated the majority of my inheritance to create a foundation dedicated to supporting abandoned and isolated seniors. For a moment, nobody reacted. It was as if the room needed time to process what it had heard. Then applause erupted, loud, powerful, emotional. People stood. Some cried. Others smiled. The director covered her mouth in shock. She hadn't known either. Very few people had. The foundation would provide transportation, companionship programs, emergency support, social activities, and assistance for elderly individuals without family support. It would help people who felt forgotten, people who needed hope, people like me. The applause continued, but my attention shifted toward the back of the room, toward my children. Their faces told a different story. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Michael looked pale. Susan appeared frozen. David stared at me as though he had measured. I hadn't, and neither had they. The inheritance they expected to receive someday was no longer waiting for them. At least not in the way they imagined. After the event ended, dozens of people approached me. Some thanked me, some hugged me, others simply shook my hand. One elderly woman cried while speaking to me. "You've given people like us hope." Her words meant more than any amount of money ever could. Eventually, I made my way toward the parking lot. That's when I heard someone call my name. Dad. I turned around. All 3 children were walking toward me. And judging by their expressions, this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Michael spoke first. What was that? His voice sounded strained. I remained calm. What do you mean? The foundation. Susan crossed her arms. You donated most of the inheritance. I nodded. David looked stunned. You gave away millions of dollars? I looked directly at him. No, I answered quietly. I invested it. They stared at me. I continued. I invested it in people who actually needed help. The silence that followed felt endless. Michael finally shook his head. Dad, this doesn't make any sense. It makes perfect sense. Susan's voice became sharper. What about your family? The question nearly made me laugh. My family. Where had this concern been during lonely birthdays? Hospital visits. Empty holidays. Years of silence. I looked at all 3 of them. Then I asked a question. When was the last time any of you visited because you wanted to see me rather than discuss money? Nobody answered, because nobody could. The truth was standing between us, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. David looked away. Susan became quiet. Michael clenched his jaw. I wasn't angry. That surprised even me. For years, I thought this conversation would be filled with resentment. Instead, I felt calm, because I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed them to validate my worth. That realization changed everything. Michael eventually spoke again. You should have discussed this with us first. I looked directly into his eyes. Why? No answer. You never discussed abandoning me. Silence. You never discussed forgetting my birthdays. More silence. You never discussed leaving me alone after hospital visits. Nobody spoke, because there was nothing to say. The truth had finally caught up with all of us, and truth has a way of making excuses disappear. That evening I returned home exhausted, but lighter than I had felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully. Yet I had no idea what was coming next, because the public announcement was only the beginning. My children weren't finished, not even close. In fact, over the following weeks, their behavior would become more desperate than I ever imagined. Phone calls would increase. Visits would become frequent. Promises would suddenly appear. Apologies would be offered. And eventually, they would come begging. But by then, something inside me had already changed. And there was no going back. The first phone call came 2 days after the announcement. It was Michael. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hello, his voice sounded unusually friendly. Hey, Dad, how are you doing? For a second, I almost smiled. Not because I was happy, because I remembered how long it had been since he had asked that question. Years, not days.
Not weeks? Years.
I'm doing fine, I replied. That's good. That's really good. There was an awkward pause. Then he began talking about family, about memories, about old times, about things we hadn't discussed in decades. The conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes, longer than all our conversations from the previous year combined. When the call ended, I sat quietly in my chair. Part of me wanted to believe things were changing. Part of me wanted to believe my son genuinely missed me. But another part remembered something important. People rarely change overnight, especially when money is involved. The next day, Susan called. The day after that, David called. Then Michael called again. Suddenly, everyone wanted a relationship. Everyone wanted connection. Everyone wanted time together. The same children who couldn't spare 5 minutes before now seemed to have endless free time. The timing was difficult to ignore. A week later, Susan arrived at my house carrying homemade pie. Apple pie, my favorite. At least it used to be. She walked into the kitchen smiling warmly. Thought I'd surprise you. I thanked her. We sat together at the table. For a while, the conversation felt normal. Comfortable, even. Then she sighed heavily. Dad, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I remained quiet. I know we haven't been as close as we should have been. There it was. The beginning of an apology. but not quite an apology. The words sounded rehearsed, carefully chosen, safe, as though she wanted credit for acknowledging the problem without actually taking responsibility for it. I listened. She talked about being busy, about raising children, about life's challenges. Everything except the one thing that mattered, her choices. When she finished, I simply nodded. Then I asked a question. "Susan, do you know what day my birthday is?" She blinked, caught off guard. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she quietly named the wrong date. My heart sank. Not because she forgot, but because she didn't even realize she had forgotten. The room became silent. Her eyes filled with embarrassment. For the first time, she understood a small part of what I had been feeling. Invisible. After she left, I sat alone again. But this time the loneliness felt different, less painful, because something had changed inside me. I no longer needed my children to become the people I wished they were. I was finally accepting them for who they actually were. That acceptance brought freedom. The following weekend, all 3 children arrived together. Again, the same people who couldn't coordinate a birthday visit for years somehow managed multiple family meetings in a single month. Interesting. Very interesting. We sat in the living room. Coffee cups rested on the table. Nobody seemed eager to start the conversation. Finally, David cleared his throat. "Dad, we think you've made a mistake." I almost laughed, not because the statement was funny, because it was predictable. "A mistake?" I asked. Michael nodded. "Giving away that much money wasn't necessary." I studied their faces, every expression, every movement, every word. Then I asked calmly, "Necessary for whom?" No one answered immediately. Susan shifted uncomfortably. David looked toward the floor. Michael sighed. And suddenly I realized something. For the first time in their lives, they were facing consequences they couldn't control. They had assumed the inheritance belonged to them. Not legally, but emotionally, mentally. They had already spent it in their minds. Now that fantasy was gone, and they didn't know how to handle it. Michael leaned forward. "Dad, we're just concerned." I nodded. "Concerned about me?" "Of course." "Or concerned about the money?" Silence. Again, the truth has a way of creating silence, especially when people don't want to hear it. Nobody argued. Nobody denied it, because deep down they knew, and so did I. The conversation ended awkwardly. They left frustrated. I remained calm. Weeks passed. The foundation continued growing. Volunteers joined. Programs expanded. New partnerships formed. The project was helping more seniors than I ever imagined. Letters began arriving from people whose lives had been touched by the organization. One man wrote that weekly visits from volunteers had ended years of isolation. Another woman said transportation services allowed her to attend medical appointments she previously missed. Every letter reminded me why I had made my decision. Every story confirmed I had done the right thing. Then something unexpected happened. A young volunteer named Emma began visiting regularly. She was 27 years old, kind, thoughtful, funny. She reminded me a little of Margaret, not because they looked alike, because they both possessed a rare gift. They paid attention. When Emma asked how I was doing, she genuinely wanted the answer. When she listened completely. No phones, no distractions, no hidden agenda, just presence. One afternoon, she asked me a question. "When was the last time your family came to visit before all of this happened?" I thought about it, really thought about it. The answer surprised even me. "Honestly," she nodded, "probably over a year." Her expression changed, not judgment, not pity, sadness. The sadness people feel when they hear a painful truth. Then she said something I will never forget. "Sometimes the family we choose treats us better than the family we're born into." I thought about those words for days, because there was wisdom in them. The foundation had introduced me to people who cared, volunteers, staff members, seniors, neighbors, people who checked on me simply because they wanted to, not because they expected something in return, not because they were protecting an inheritance, just because they cared. And strangely enough, that made me feel richer than the money ever had. Meanwhile, my children became increasingly desperate. The phone calls continued. The visits increased. The apologies became more direct. One evening, Michael appeared at my front door unexpectedly. His eyes looked tired, older somehow. We sat together on the porch as the sun began to set. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he finally broke the silence. "Dad, I'm sorry." Those words caught me off guard, not because they were dramatic, because they sounded real. For the first time, there were no excuses, no justifications, just an apology, simple, honest, human. I should have been there. I looked at him quietly. I know. His eyes filled with tears, and suddenly I saw something I hadn't seen in years. My son, not the businessman, not the father, not the man worried about money, just my son, a flawed human being carrying his own regrets. That moment changed something. Not everything, but something. Because forgiveness doesn't happen all at once. It's a process, a journey, a choice made repeatedly. And for the first time, I wondered whether reconciliation might still be possible. Not because of the inheritance, not because of guilt, but because people can sometimes learn, sometimes grow, sometimes change. The question was whether my children truly wanted a relationship, or whether they simply wanted what they had lost. The answer would soon become clear, because a few weeks later, all 3 children would sit across from me and make a request so shocking, so unexpected, that it would force every one of us to confront the truth once and for all. And when that conversation finally happened, years of pain, regret, love, disappointment, and hope would collide in a single unforgettable moment. A few weeks after my conversation with Michael on the porch, I received a call from Susan. Her voice sounded nervous. "Dad, can we all come over on Sunday?" I already knew who "we" meant. All 3 of them. Michael, Susan, David. The same children who had slowly disappeared from my life. The same children who suddenly reappeared after hearing about the inheritance. Part of me wanted to say no, not out of anger, out of exhaustion. Years of disappointment leave marks that don't disappear overnight. But another part of me knew this conversation needed to happen. So I agreed. Sunday arrived. The house felt strangely familiar. It reminded me of old family gatherings from decades ago. The difference was that this time there was tension in the air. The kind of tension that comes when people know difficult truths are waiting to be spoken. When they arrived, I greeted them politely. Nobody seemed interested in small talk. Nobody talked about the weather. Nobody discussed sports or television. We all knew why we were there. After a few minutes, we gathered around the dining room table. The same table where birthdays had been celebrated. The same table where Margaret used to serve holiday meals. The same table where our family once felt whole. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then David finally broke the silence. "Dad, we need to talk." I nodded. "I'm listening." The 3 of them exchanged nervous glances, and then something unexpected happened. Susan began crying, not dramatic tears, not forced tears, real tears. The kind that come from carrying something heavy for a long time. "I don't know how to say this," she whispered. "Then just tell the truth," as she lowered her eyes. "We failed you." The room became silent. No excuses. No explanations. No blaming schedules. No blaming work. No blaming distance. Just truth. 3 simple words. We failed you. For years, that was all I wanted. Not money. Not gifts. Not grand gestures. Acknowledgement. Recognition. Honesty. Michael spoke next. We kept telling ourselves we'd visit next week. His voice cracked. Then next week became next month. David nodded slowly. And next month became another year. Nobody tried to defend themselves. Nobody argued. For the first time, they were facing reality without hiding from it. And that mattered. It mattered more than they realized. Then Michael took a deep breath. "Dad, when you announced what you did with the inheritance..." He paused. I was angry. I appreciated the honesty. "I know. I thought you were punishing us." I remained quiet. But after a while, I realized something. His eyes filled with regret. You weren't punishing us, no. You were helping people. I nodded. Wes! And the reason it upset me so much, he looked away, was because deep down I thought that money belonged to us. The room fell silent again. There it was. The truth. The ugly truth. The truth nobody wanted to admit. The inheritance had become an expectation, an assumption, something they believed would eventually arrive. And when it didn't, they were forced to confront their own motives. Susan wiped her eyes. I hate admitting this. Then don't admit it for me, I said softly. Admit it for yourself. She nodded. Then she whispered the words. I was thinking about the money. David followed. So was I. For years, I imagined this moment. The confrontation, the accountability, the reckoning. I thought it would feel satisfying, victorious. But it didn't. It felt sad, because these weren't strangers. They were my children, and despite everything, I still loved them. A parent never completely stops loving their children, even when they break your heart, even when they disappoint you, even when they forget you. Love remains, sometimes wounded, sometimes buried, but still there. After a long silence, Susan looked directly at me. Can you forgive us? The question hung in the air. Heavy, important, life-changing. I thought about every forgotten birthday, every empty holiday, every unanswered phone call, every lonely evening, every hospital visit, every broken promise. Then I thought about something Margaret used to say. Holding on to resentment is like carrying a heavy suitcase long after the journey is over. Eventually, it only hurts the person carrying it. I looked at my children, not as adults, not as disappointments, not as people who had hurt me. I looked at them as the little children they once were. The little boy who ran into my arms after his first baseball game. The little girl who fell asleep on my shoulder during road trips. The youngest son who used to hold my hand while crossing the street. Those children still existed somewhere beneath the mistakes, beneath the selfishness, beneath the regret. And suddenly I realized something. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It simply refuses to let the past control the future. So I smiled, a small smile, and I answered, yes. Susan cried harder. David lowered his head. Michael covered his face with his hands. Years of tension seemed to leave the room all at once. But forgiveness wasn't the end of the conversation. It was the beginning, because forgiveness without change means very little. I leaned forward. There is something you need to understand. They listened carefully. The inheritance was never the most valuable thing I had. Nobody spoke. I pointed toward an old photograph hanging on the wall, a photograph of our family from many years ago. When your mother was alive, this house was rich. They looked at the picture, but didn't have millions. I smiled. But we had dinner together. I paused. We talked. Another pause. We laughed. My voice softened. We showed up for each other. The room became emotional again. That's the inheritance I wanted to leave behind. Not money, not property, not investments, connection, love, presence, family. The things money can never buy. Then I surprised them. There is still something left. 3 confused faces looked at me. The foundation had received most of the inheritance, but not all of it. A portion remained under my control. Their expressions immediately changed. I noticed it, the curiosity, the anticipation, the concern. Then I smiled, because this time things would be different. I've decided what will happen to it. Nobody interrupted. I will create educational scholarships for my grandchildren. Their eyes widened. The money won't go directly to anyone. I continued. It will help future generations build meaningful lives. Nobody argued. Nobody complained. And for the first time, nobody asked for more. Because finally, they understood. This was never about money. It was about values. Months passed. Then a year. Something remarkable happened. The phone calls continued. But now they weren't about finances. The visits continued. But now they happened without special occasions, without inheritance discussions, without hidden agendas. Michael started coming every Saturday morning for coffee. Susan called every Sunday evening. David visited twice a month, sometimes bringing his children. Slowly, patiently, imperfectly, a family began rebuilding itself, not because of money, because of honesty, because of accountability, because people finally chose to make time for one another. At 84 years old, my life looked very different than I imagined. The foundation continued helping seniors. Hundreds of lives were touched, then thousands. The loneliness that once defined my days became something else. Purpose. Connection. Meaning, one evening I sat on the porch watching another sunset. The same porch, the same chair, the same house, but everything felt different. A photograph of Margaret rested beside me. I picked it up and smiled. "I think you'd be proud," I whispered. The breeze moved gently through the trees, and for a moment I could almost feel her presence. Not sadness, not regret. Peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop measuring wealth by what you own and start measuring it by the lives you touch. My children eventually came begging, but not for money. Not anymore. They came begging for another chance, a chance to rebuild what had been broken, a chance to become a family again. And in the end, that turned out to be worth far more than any inheritance. Because money can be spent, money can be lost, money can disappear. But love, when given a second chance, can change generations. And that was the greatest inheritance of all, the end.